Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
He was sullen, so I thought I could brighten his day with a smile. Yeah, that was a terrible idea. He certainly wasn't the only gloomy character I'd ever spotted on the early evening train. For many of us, it's a very long journey home from the city. We wear crestfallen expressions, decompressing after another soul-crushing day at work. Nevertheless, this particular man caught my attention. He was standing on the opposite side of the carriage, firmly fixated on the doors behind me. His vacant brown eyes hardly seemed to register what they were seeing. He had a pale complexion, and his skin sagged as if it were too loose for the bald head on which it hung. Most importantly, he was sulking. I smiled. If only I could retract that smile. Anyway, I beamed brightly, striving to cheer the man up. It took a long time for the sour-faced gentleman to notice the upbeat teenage girl who was facing him. Well, it probably only took a couple of seconds, but that certainly feels like a long time to maintain an unreciprocated smile. Eventually, thankfully, the man began to turn. His expression did not change. His body did not move. His head simply rotated enough to keep his eyes firmly locked onto mine. I waited for his frown to turn upside down. It didn't. Slowly, sinisterly, the man shook his head. It was only a slight movement, but that made it all the more intimidating. He shook his head as if to say, "You shouldn't be doing that." My glowing grin immediately dissipated, of course. I cast my eyes to the ground, feeling humiliated. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, ignoring the burning sensation that scorched my cheeks. Ooh, how many more stops? I wondered. The most perturbing thing about the entire situation was that the man did not stop looking at me. I could see him in my peripheral vision. Despite my averted gaze, I could still feel those beady little eyes boring into my skull. He did not move, he just stared sullenly. I did what I always do in uncomfortable situations. I went on Reddit. I switched to my throwaway account and asked for advice on dealing with odd people. I fully explained my predicament. Most people just called him a creep. They said to move down the carriage. One user popped up on my private chat. I won't include his username, but he had something more unsettling to tell me. Why would you smile at the morose man? I thought he was screwing with me. I asked why he was calling the stranger the morose man. From your description, I realized who you'd seen. I played along with the prankster, asking him about the morose man, who I assumed to be some sort of urban legend. He minds his own business unless somebody disturbs his peace, and you just disturbed him. You need to get off that train and run. His wrath eventually subsides and he goes on his way. He will pursue you until midnight. My chest started to tighten. I did not believe in ghost stories, but felt something I still couldn't explain. I knew that the Reddit user was telling the truth. I felt it. I could feel it in the man's awful eyes, still watching me. I asked the mystery messenger what the man was going to do. He wasn't doing anything particularly threatening. He was standing still. Why does that matter? Just stay away from him. What time is it in your part of the world? 6:59 p.m. Right, 5 hours. Just stay away from him and make sure that you avoid doorways. I thought that final sentence was a little peculiar, but it was definitely no more peculiar than the user's claim that this dismal gentleman was some sort of unearthly being. That being said, I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. I don't scare easily. This stranger, however, terrified me. We were frozen in that state for another 20 minutes or so. When the train eventually reached the next station, I slinked out of the open doors. I still hadn't looked up from my phone. I didn't want to see the man's ghoulish face. I just wanted to get home. Once I was on the platform, I stopped walking backward. I stood and waited, trying my best to watch the man out of the corner of my vision. He didn't move. He stayed on the train. The doors closed. I cried exuberantly as the train pulled away. What a fool you've made of yourself, Paige, I thought. You let anxiety get the better of you, and now you're at the wrong station. Fantastic. Perhaps the foreboding feeling in my body had simply dissipated because I was no longer near that haunting man. Perhaps it was simply that his gaze was no longer upon me. Whatever the case, I felt normal again. I felt stupid, and I began to stroll out of the station. I was bursting for the toilet. I hate public bathrooms, but I knew I still had a long journey ahead of me, so I decided to face my phobia. I strolled into the empty bathroom, which was illuminated by a cold, clinical fluorescent light. Choosing the first cubicle, I entered, sat down, and opened up the Uber app. I was still about 40 minutes from home if I were to travel by car, and most of the nearby Ubers were not really nearby at all. After about 10 minutes of faffing, I booked one and groaned at the text box, which explained that there would be about a 30-minute wait time. 8 p.m., home by 8:40 p.m. Great. Dinner, then bed. The main bathroom door suddenly opened. I ignored it, continuing to scroll through my phone. Shoes clumped across the tiled floor. They were very heavy. Slow. Purposeful. The footsteps stopped. I looked down and saw 2 black, smart shoes poking beneath the bottom of my cubicle door. There are 2 other cubicles, I pointed out. Knock. Just one knock. That was all. I looked a little more closely at the black footwear and realized, much to my terror, that I was looking at men's shoes. Excuse me, I timidly whispered. Are you in the right bathroom? Knock. Just fuck off, I screamed. An awful feeling came over me. I hoped somebody would come. Somebody had to come. I frantically opened my phone and messaged the Reddit user without fully accepting why I was doing it. I don't think you need me to tell you who's on the other side of that door. I asked my anonymous savior what I should do. Don't open the door. I told you to stay away from doorways. Just wait for somebody else to come into the bathroom. Remember, the morose man doesn't like to be disturbed. If somebody enters, he should leave. So I waited and waited. I waited until the Uber came and left. Then something dawned on me. I could wait in the cubicle until morning, surely. No such luck, according to my online guru. Closer to midnight, his patience wears thin. For now, he's polite. Soon, he won't be polite. You should pray that somebody enters and interrupts him. I looked at the time on my phone, 8:37 p.m. Then I looked at the bottom of the cubicle door. The knocking had ceased, but the shoes remained. I leaned to one side on the toilet seat, peering through the crack between the door and the cubicle wall, hoping to catch a glimpse of the figure on the other side. Perhaps I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't, in fact, the morose man. I couldn't see him. He was standing too far to the side. And then A face slid into view, peering through the gap between the cubicle door and wall, revealing the insidious thing on the other side. Its brown eye was now black. I screamed in panic, instantly jerking myself back to the center of the toilet seat, not daring to move. I wanted to keep messaging my mystery Reddit friend, but he also gave me the creeps. Why did he know so much about the Morose man anyway? I searched for information about the malicious entity on the internet. Nothing. To calm myself, I decided to accept my position of powerlessness and simply scroll through social media. I wanted something grounded, something based on reality. I know, I never thought I'd say such a thing about social networks. Wait, the police, I thought. I dialed 999. It rang. I was asked which emergency service I wanted to reach. I opened my mouth to answer, but then... knock, 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 knock. A series of frantic, enraged thuds rattled the cubicle door back and forth. My mouth was open, but no sound escaped my lips. I was petrified. A shushing sound quietly hissed from the other side of the door. I hung up the phone. I suppose it was not a good idea to disturb the Morose man. I paused. What other options did I have? I had the idea to ask the Reddit messenger to call the police on my behalf, but the Morose man shushed me more aggressively, as if he were reading my thoughts. I thought of screaming for help, but he unleashed a croaking wail that sounded like a feral beast caught in a bear trap. I stopped trying to think of solutions. Don't disturb him. I waited. 9:27 p.m. I was running out of time. 2 hours of frozen terror in a train station bathroom. Trains kept arriving, but nobody was coming into the bathroom. And there wouldn't be many more trains before midnight. That meant there wouldn't be many more potential bathroom goers. I replayed the Reddit user's message in my head with every passing moment. Soon he won't be polite. 10:31 p.m. The knocking resumed. The overhead light started to dim as the Morose man were gradually extinguishing it. I shuddered ceaselessly, lifting my knees up to my chin and wrapping my arms around them. 11:41 p.m. After 4 hours in the bathroom, I heard a train, possibly the last train of the evening, pull into the station. The bathroom door finally opened. 2 chattering, inebriated women entered the room. I saw the black shoes of the Morose man hurriedly scuttle to the cubicle beside me, and he closed the door behind him. I hate having to touch gross toilet door handles after washing my hands, one of the girls said. I'm gonna wedge this door open with my shoe. Chantel, I don't want to fucking talk about bathroom doors. You're such a bitch, one of the girls said. Did you just see that man, Tara? Chantel asked. Hey, don't change the subject, Tara spat. You know that guy in the club saw me first, and... Tara stopped mid-sentence as she saw me hurtle from my cubicle like a deranged animal slipping on the tiled floor. I sprinted for the exit. You all right, love? Tara drunkenly slurred. Please, I begged. Move out of the way. I need to get out of here. Hey, I told you there was a creepy man in here, Chantel said, marching past me. He's been harassing this poor girl, I bet. Hey, mate! My heart sank as I saw Chantel strutting toward the cubicle door next to the one I just exited. She pounded furiously on the middle cubicle door. Don't do that, I pleaded. Remember, the Morose man doesn't like to be disturbed. We've got you, babe, Tara promised, patting my back. Chantel roared like a lioness and booted the cubicle door inwards with the one high-heeled shoe that she was still wearing. The door practically flew off its hinges, ricocheting off the cubicle wall. I held my breath, waiting for the man to charge at her. What the fuck? Chantel gasped. He's not in here. Tara snorted with laughter. You dumb bitch, you probably imagined him. Torrential sweat oozed from my goosebump-riddled flesh. The The man had strolled into the cubicle beside me. I heard him. Where did he go? This wasn't right. This was all horribly wrong. I started to back toward the exit, bumping into Tara, who was still blocking the doorway. Chantel frowned. "No, I'm telling you, Tara." The girl trailed off, looking in my direction. Her complexion turned paler than that of the morose man. Her eyes widened, her jaw slacked, and her arms fell stiffly to her sides. She unleashed a primal scream of horror. Consumed by unimaginable fear, I realized that I hadn't bumped into Tara. I took a few tentative steps forwards before slowly turning on my heel. The bathroom exit led to a pitch-black train station. The lights were gone. The people were gone. All I could see was the morose man and the unholy act that he was committing. Tara's body was slowly being ingested into the gaping mouth of the black-eyed man. He had grown a foot taller, and his looming figure filled most of the doorway. His morose mouth had widened to squeeze Tara's still wriggling body inside. He used the now abnormally long fingers on his gnarled, ghoulish hands to hold the girl's ankles. He was forcing her head first into his nightmarish gullet. I chose flight. Chantel chose fight. I started to back toward the cubicles, but the manic girl beside me ran towards the exit, screeching at the entity and begging it to release her friend. The man was still greedily swallowing Tara's spasming, half-alive body, but he unwrapped the fingers on his left hand from her ankle and seized Chantel by the neck. As I continued to back toward the farthest cubicle, I watched the morose man complete one course and prepare for the next. Chantel was certainly much louder than Tara. She unleashed a series of short, pained yelps, her cries muffled by the inside of the creature's body as he slit her down his throat. I threw open the cubicle door, locked it behind me, and immediately looked at my phone. 11:43 p.m. That traumatizing scene of unfathomable gore took place in the space of 2 fucking minutes. How? Shoes clumped against the tiles. I found myself where I'd started. I was trapped in the bathroom stall, staring at the shoes that poked through the door's bottom. The morose man had grown so large that he could poke his head over the top of the cubicle door. The horrifying apparition still wore that dejected expression and shook its head at me. His morbid frown lifted into a sickening smile for a split second, then it quickly returned to a state of moroseness. The man shook his head at me, much as he had on the train. He was reminding me of what I'd done wrong. I flipped the toilet lid down, clambered onto it, and squished my body against the back wall, trying to escape the wretched thing before me. The morose man was not finished. Midnight was fast approaching, and his patience was wearing out. The elongated fingers on his 2 hands suddenly appeared, grasping the top of the cubicle door. He violently wobbled it in its hinges. I started to blubber, looking down at the phone in my hand. Every minute felt like an eternity. 11:45 p.m. I wouldn't make it to midnight. I was sure of that. The man reached an arm over the top of the cubicle door, stretching his hellish fingers toward the lock. It fumbled clumsily, trying to slide the door open. I'm not going to stand here and wait to die. I turned to my right and started to pull myself over the wall of the cubicle beside me. I heard the lock slide across when I landed on the other side. The monster barreled into the cubicle I'd just exited. I knew I only had moments to spare, so I fled the middle cubicle and ran toward the bathroom exit. Welcoming the dark embrace of the train station, I didn't pause to look over my shoulder. I already knew that the morose man would be following me. He could find me anywhere. That was when I remembered what the Reddit user had repeatedly said. I told you to stay away from doorways. I know, I was an idiot. Well, I hadn't believed in the morose man. Not really. You can't blame me for going into the bathroom. I'd already put the fright on the train out of my head. I viewed it as a moment of anxiety. I could no longer deny it as I ran across the train platform. I looked over my shoulder. The man was striding across the platform. Slowly and surely, he was striding towards me. But he was slow, and he wouldn't catch me. As long as I stay away from doorways, I can't escape. I kept running. I ran until I reached the end of the platform. I realized I'd foolishly forgotten how to exit the train station. Fuck that, I thought. I don't want to go near doorways. Throwing caution to the wind, with my life hanging in the balance, I jumped down from the platform onto the railway line. I followed the tree-lined train tracks, glancing at my phone. 11:51 p.m. I glanced behind me. The morose man was in pursuit, but he seemed even taller now. Taller than any human. And he seemed faster. Much faster. I had to get out of the open. I was too exposed. I darted to my right, entered the forest, and lit the way with my phone. No doors in the forest, and the trees were tightly grouped together, so the gargantuan man would have to shrink back to human size if he were to follow. It seemed like my best option. I weaved between trees, casting my torchlight before me so as not to bump into anything. I didn't want to end up flat on my face. I didn't want to be the morose man's dessert. I heard that unearthly wail once more. It was terrifying enough to startle all of the peaceful creatures in the forest. Birds flew from trees and grounded animals rustled in bushes, fleeing the scene. I switched my phone off. No more light. I didn't really think it would make a difference. I felt the man could still find me, even without light or a doorway. Just a few minutes, Paige. You just need to last a few minutes, I convinced myself. Except for the sound of my shoes crunching against leaves, the forest was completely silent. I could scarcely see the outlines of trees in the darkness. The canopy of leaves above me prevented any moonlight from illuminating my surroundings. I heard the booming snap of what sounded like a thick tree branch. The man was close, very close. I desperately wanted to check the time on my phone, but I tried to rely on my body clock. Every second felt like an hour, but I grounded myself. It must be at least 11:55 p.m., I thought. I crept forwards, failing at stealthily traversing the forest. Every step seemed to make noisy contact with leaves and twigs. I tried to quicken the pace. There was no use in concealing my location. He knew where to find me. I suddenly heard low breathing from a few yards behind me. Not daring to turn around, I screamed at the top of my lungs and sprinted ahead, roughly scraping my shoulder against the jagged bark of a tree. I grimaced, but adrenaline pushed me onwards. I fumbled for the phone in my pocket and used it again as my flashlight. I also needed to know the time. I couldn't resist any longer. 11:59 p.m., of course. I continued to swerve between trees, praying that I wouldn't trip, praying that I wouldn't bump into another tree. One more obstacle could be the death of me. Midnight. I couldn't believe it. I yelled victoriously, twisting around. My flashlight shone on the horrifying specter before me. The morose man was now the height of the trees around him, slinking his skeletal body between them, pursuing me. My heart thumped. Maybe the Reddit user lied. Maybe the morose man never stops. I closed my eyes and braced myself for death. I braced, succumbing to a feeling of pure horror. I felt a brittle limb brush against my clothes. I opened my eyes to the man walking past me, brushing one of his spindly legs against my coat. I turned around, cast my light onto him, and watched as the spider-like 10-foot-tall man vanished into the depths of the forest. If you ever see a morose gentleman, don't disturb him. Do not smile at him.
His secretary had asked him if he'd had time for an interview today. Some small-time reporter looking to earn a few clicks out of a chat with an old businessman. He declined, of course. Told her to reschedule for next week, although, even if he was alive by then, he'd still find a way to dodge the little bastard. 30 or so years back, he'd absolutely relished in this sort of thing. The attention, the acknowledgement of his success. It was what fueled him. Every dream he'd ever had ended in this. Recognition. Praise. Good job. Nowadays, it was just an annoyance. And an irritating speed bump in his otherwise busy day, and any part of him that still wanted to illuminate the life of whatever little reporter begged for an interview from him was long dead. He was a busy man with bigger fish to fry. As he drove through the heavy fog down the quiet dirt road, past old cottages and run-down stores, he couldn't help but scoff internally at just how twee this place was. Twee. That was really the only word he could think of to use. He'd heard a business partner use it once, and the word had grown on him. Once upon a time, these encompassing forests and run-down marinas had been the greatest thing in the world to him, but now that he had seen even greater things, they held none of the luster they'd had when he was a boy. Well, perhaps not all of that luster. He did catch himself slowing down slightly as he passed the most familiar of the old bait-and-tackle stores that dotted the roads along the lakeside. The sign was old and faded, the colors long since worn away by time, but he could still faintly read the name of the store. Beck's Bait. Surprisingly, the place still looked open. How unusual. It had been about 50 years since he'd last stepped through the doors of Beck's, with his little brother Adam right on his heels. Adam had been a good kid. He could have gone far in life. They almost religiously picked themselves out a chocolate bar and a soda each, along with a tin of worms, before walking back to their parents' cottage along the dirt road. Usually they'd head right back out onto the dock and enjoy the sun for a little while before getting to fishing. Usually they didn't catch much more than minnows, but once, maybe twice a year, one of them would catch something that would have a place on the dinner table. The memory of it brought the ghost of a smile to his face before he moved on, leaving Beck's behind. The cottage wasn't far now, the time was short, and he knew better than to dawdle. Up ahead, through the fog, he spotted the faded sign that told him where to turn. The Dawsons' cottage. He and Adam had painted that sign themselves in their father's workshop. They'd both been grinning from ear to ear when they'd watch him nail it up. Time hadn't been kind to it. The text was only barely legible, and the fog didn't help. But the ghosts of the words on the sign was more than enough to let him know that after all this time, he'd found his way home again. Exhaling heavily, he turned the car down the overgrown dirt road to the cottage where he'd spent the best years of his life. He kept a tight grip on the steering wheel before looking at the clock. He still had a few hours. He was sure of that much. His car was not made to handle the rough dirt road, and it rocked and jolted on the uneven terrain. If he'd had a little more foresight, he might have rented something more suited to coming out here. But now was not the time to think about what he could have done better. That time had passed long ago. The cottage loomed up ahead of him, secluded and cut off from the rest of the world. It had been a good 15 years or so since he'd been back, although, despite that, the cottage did not by any means look bad. He'd at least had the foresight to pay someone to maintain it, and they'd done a decent enough job. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't collapsing in on itself either. It would do, for now. The cottage had ended up in his name after his father had died, and he had visited a handful of times since then. But eventually his schedule grew too busy, his interests led him elsewhere, and he found himself with less use for the property. Of course, he could never bring himself to sell it. Heavens, no. That would be next to absolute madness. He could never sell this land, not for any price. It wasn't just sentimental value that made this place important. He'd learned long ago that there was no room for sentimentality in a man. But this place had a value to him that no check could match. Over the past 50 years, all of the good things that had come to him came from here. Every business partnership, every wise investment, every decision that had brought him to the top had come from this place. His car rolled to a stop in front of the old cottage, and he got out, breathing in the deep fog and smelling the foul scent of decay on it. He huffed before trudging toward the front door and trying the keys. The door opened with a creak, and he stepped inside to the darkness that awaited inside. With a bit of fumbling, he was able to find the light switch, and with a stern look on his face, he surveyed the old cottage. It had changed little since last he'd been there. It was clean and tidy, yes, but it was also clearly abandoned. Somehow that brought him some comfort. He closed and locked the door behind him before reaching into his suit jacket and taking out the revolver he carried with him. Methodically, he checked over the gun to ensure that it looked good before he set it down on the counter. He'd never been one for firearms, but he made a point to learn in his youth. As a boy, he'd thought it would be cool to own a gun, like the old-fashioned cowboys who'd been his heroes. Nowadays, he only ever carried it when it was practical, and he never actually fired it outside of a shooting range. But that was to be expected. He made his way over to the rear of the cottage and lifted the blinds to look out over the lake. A thick fog covered most of it and rolled up the hill leading down to the dock. But the dock itself was visible. It waited for him against the pale, glassy surface of the lake, the tip of it only barely visible. No boats were moored, and he could see none on the water. As far as he could tell, he was well enough alone. He studied the water, looking for any trace of movement, a ripple, a sign of life. There was nothing. Satisfied, he turned away and reached into his pocket for his cigarettes. He'd started smoking when he was 13, naturally. As soon as Adam caught him with a cigarette, he'd wanted to try one too. Adam really had idolized him. In hindsight, he probably should have been more touched than he was, but back then, his little brother's admiration had gotten on his nerves more often than not. When he started smoking, Adam had wanted to smoke. When he was mowing the lawn, Adam wanted to mow the lawn too. When he was with his friends, Adam wanted to be with his friends too. It had started to grate on him, but that was simply what brothers did, have done since the beginning of time. Looking back at all of it, he felt a little silly, having been so frustrated by it all. But no matter what he thought now, he wouldn't have changed a thing that happened. Not one little thing. When he was 14 and Adam was 9, a friend of his told him about a book he'd found. Now, at a glance, the book was full of nothing but nonsense, occult mumbo-jumbo that was bound to scare some dumb boys. None of them actually took any of it seriously, but he'd let himself get drawn into the weird incantations and rituals depicted in the book, and Adam had done so as well. It had been Adam's suggestion that they actually try some of these rituals. He'd never actually believed it would work, but Adam had been persistent, and so, to shut him up, he agreed to try just one spell. The spell they'd chosen was supposedly Well, it was supposed to bring rain, and it involved a simple ceremony. One of them would draw a sigil, and the other would place a bell inside of it. Then one would pour water upon that bell and strike it 3 times, then 3 more times. He and Adam had drawn the sigil exactly as outlined in the book, and performed the ceremony as specified, and then they waited. Once they'd rung the bell for the last time, Adam had immediately run to the window in the hope that it would suddenly be pouring rain. But the sun still shone outside, much to his disappointment. He remembered that he'd said, "It's all right, maybe it'll rain tomorrow," in the hope that it might cheer Adam up. Adam just looked glumly at him and said, "Yeah, maybe tomorrow." They hadn't needed to wait that long, though. The rain had come on suddenly before mid-afternoon, and it came down hard. He couldn't remember seeing a downpour so bad before or since. And he couldn't forget the ear-to-ear grin that Adam had worn as he realized that their little spell had worked and that they had just tapped into something that only a handful of people ever truly understood. A couple of days later during school, he'd snuck the book out of his friend's backpack. He played dumb when his friend later couldn't find it, and made sure to hide it well inside his room. He didn't want to lose the power that they'd found, after all. The rituals continued after that, always just small things. Summoning snow on winter's days when they didn't feel like going to school. That year had just so happened to have a record snowfall. Conjuring little illusions for their own entertainment. Like children with a loaded gun, they played with a power beyond their comprehension. Well, Adam's comprehension. Adam had no interest in the deeper secrets of the book, but he did. In that ancient text, he read about worlds beyond the one he knew, about impossible beasts with insatiable hunger, and about rituals that could plot the course of a man's life in directions he could only have fantasized about. If, of course, one had the stomach to perform them. It seemed worth it, a little sacrifice, in exchange for a life of success. Sure, he'd miss Adam, but Adam wouldn't really be dead now, would he? They'd get plenty of chances to speak again, and when they did, his little brother would be so much more useful to him. He'd performed the ritual one afternoon, while their parents had been out on the boat and they'd been alone in the cottage. They'd walked down to Beck's, as they'd done so many times before, to get their chocolate, soda, and worms, and then they walked back. Adam had been smiling, unaware of what was waiting for him. He drank his soda, eaten his chocolate, and run down to the dock so they could start fishing. Adam didn't see it when he took out the knife. He didn't have the chance to react until the blade was sinking into his flesh, carving the binding runes into him. And even then, all he could do was vainly struggle and scream before he was thrown off the edge of the dock. Adam had tried to resurface, of course, but he'd never made it back to land. He'd placed his hands on Adam's shoulders and forced him back under. He'd held him beneath the water, looking into his brother's eyes, until he knew that he'd gotten what he'd wanted. Life seemed to fade from them, but he could still see the ghost of something still there, a hint of lingering consciousness. The body was mostly dead, but the soul lived on, in between the realm of life and death. Adam's eyes had remained fixed on this, and after taking a deep breath and steeling himself, he asked the first of many questions. "Where should I hide you?" It had been almost 50 years to the day since then. He'd asked countless more questions since. Questions that Adam had answered. Questions about business, about investments, about love, and about future. Almost 50 years, his oracle had remained bound, but its time was almost up. Many years ago, the book had warned him that this day would come. The runes would keep Adam bound, but not forever. There was a time limit. 50 years was all he could manage. 50 years with the body stashed beneath the dock, invisible to all but him. Adam had served him well. He'd been a good little brother and a better oracle, even if he hadn't exactly been the most willing of servants. But the time had come to cut him loose. He took a drag on his dying cigarette and checked his watch. He had little over an hour left. Best not to leave this until the last minute. With a stoic expression, he took his gun off the counter and checked it again. 6 rounds in the chamber. He'd imagined he'd only need 1 to finish this. He took a deep breath as he headed for the door, his pistol in his hand. He descended down the hill toward the dock. The fog seemed to part in front of him, as if allowing him to pass. The air felt cold and cut through his suit, and the only sound he could hear was the faint but gentle crash of waves against the rocks. The dock creaked under his shoes as he set foot upon it and made his way to the very end. The water around him didn't seem to move as he walked. The lake was impossibly still, and its surface reflected everything like a mirror. Yet, he knew that as soon as he reached the end, he would see Adam's face clearly, beneath the surface, and some primal part of him almost dreaded what he'd see. He reached the end of the dock and forced himself to look down. First of all he saw was his own reflection. But soon, he could see his own features warping and contorting. The skin of his reflection turned the sickly green of algae, and the eyes seemed to bulge. He could see the ridges of bone around the sockets, and noticed that the nose and part of the cheek were gone. It was hard to tell where the tattered flesh of the cheek ended and the moss from the lake began. The sight of him made him cover his mouth in disgust, but the gentle yet knowing smile on Adam's face was enough to truly make him want to vomit. The reflection had changed from the rotten visage of his own face to the horrible remains of Adam, the Adam he remembered, just a month shy of 10 years old and having been left to rot for the past 50 years. Unable to die but robbed of his life, in limbo, all for one man's success. "Hello again, Rick." Adam's voice was as he remembered it, but the burbling, wet sound to it sent a chill through him. The tone was not the same as the one he remembered either. Adam had never spoken quite so formally, not until after he'd become an oracle, at least. "What questions do you bring for me today?" "No questions this time," he said quietly. "No more questions." "Oh, have you finally come to set me free?" After 50 years, here at the end, he could not bring himself to give an answer. "I see. Waiting until the last moment, I see. Even when you've left me for so long." He didn't try to justify that. He was just quietly raising the gun and aimed it down toward the visage of his brother. Adam stared up at him, waiting patiently. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked. "I killed you 50 years ago," he said softly. "It's time, Adam. And you've got nothing to say for yourself, even after all this time?" Well, that gave him pause. The gun trembled in his hand before he lowered it. He was silent for a moment before he finally started to laugh. "You're really asking me for an apology?" he asked. "You really think I'm going to look back on everything and regret it all now? No. I made my choices. I made them a long time ago. I may not have enjoyed all of it, but I made my choices. I lived my life." "So you did," Adam said thoughtfully as his brother raised the gun again. He looked up into the barrel before Rick pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the silent lake, and Rick stared down into the rippling water, feeling a weight ease off of his shoulders. He'd done it. He'd dealt with his oracle. The circle was closed. He sighed and lowered the gun before turning around. "Perhaps you've lived too much," Adam's voice continued, and he froze. "Time is fickle. It gets away from us. Memories fade in old age. It's a natural part of aging. It gets harder and harder to keep track of time over 5 decades. You bound me here 50 years ago. As of 3 days ago. No. Rick turned around to see something moving at the end of the dock. A shape reached out of the water, the hand of a 9-year-old boy, pale as death, with sagging skin and algae growing off of it. Flesh had been nibbled away from the fingertips, revealing bone, but the hand still moved. Another hand reached up onto the wood of the deck, and Rick took aim at the sickening visage that emerged from the water. The arms, torso, and head resembled Adam, or at least what was left of Adam, but what came out after he'd lifted his torso onto the deck did not resemble his little brother at all. It trailed on behind him, a slimy mess of debris and scum from the depths of the lake, trailing weeds, driftwood, and the twitching rotted fins from countless dead fish. Bits of broken garbage jutted out of his new body. Bicycles, tangling fishing wire, fishing lures, and the smell was overpowering. His heart starting to race, Rick fired the gun, taking off a chunk of Adam's head. But the thing that Adam had forged himself into was not slowed. Using its arms to move itself forward, it rushed for him, moving faster than he could have expected. He fired again, but the bullet was lost in the mess of debris that consisted of his body, and he did not get the opportunity to fire a fourth shot. Adam's pale hands grabbed at him, clawing at his throat as he threw his weight onto him, knocking Rick off his feet and pinning him onto the dock. It's okay. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to let go. But I want us to be together, you and me. Let's go, Rick. Let's go. His pale hands gripped Rick's shoulders as he began to sink back into the water of the lake. Rick screamed, he thrashed and sobbed. He fought, but he could not break free. He desperately tried to grab the planks of the dock to keep himself away from the water, but his fingernails tore from his hands as he was dragged inch by inch to the end of the dock. Adam only smiled at him, letting him fight, letting him struggle. Rick looked at the cottage where he'd spent the best days of his life and desperately reached for it as if somehow, if he only tried long enough, he could grab hold of the door and pull himself to safety. But he'd sealed his own fate long ago. With a final scream, he was pulled beneath the surface of the lake and locked within Adam's embrace. The two of them vanished beneath the placid surface, and when the ripples stopped, it sat unbroken amongst the fog as silence set in again.
It's said that grief and tragedy, relentless trackers of the human soul, burrow hungrily within the folds of certain familial lines. Forsaken others and taken root to bear a dark fruit bloody of seed. Such families endure generation after generation, surviving by sheer force of will as they cast their mutated lines far-flung in a field into an unknowable future. These families and their unfortunate offspring clutch what dignity they may to their troubled bosoms, as this murmuration of sorrow feeds upon them like a murder of putrescent vultures upon an ever-waiting feast. Do not think I set upon these pages to flog myself for pity's sake in the public eye, but rather to offer a cautionary warning tale to the wise who would express their wisdom. This and nothing more. It had been 1 year to the very day since I had laid my beloved wife Lydia to rest. That is not strictly accurate, of course, as I had received no body to dress in its finery, only to be consigned to that sad and melancholy box, and then covered over with a cold and merciless earth of eternity. Lydia had undertaken a brief voyage by sea in search of certain manuscripts germane to her many years of devoted study. It was an expedition ill-advised and thoroughly against my wishes, but in the end I could brook no legitimate objection to her plans, and so had relented and surrendered my reluctant blessings, and thus did my sweet Lydia set sail upon the sea. that so short a journey of some 200 miles along our own familiar coastline, and during the bright season of summer seas and blue skies should conclude in such a tragic manner, only foreshadows the gravity of my opening preamble. For some wholly unfathomable reason, whether by folly, negligence, or an excess of foul drink, the navigator of the Cadiz, a fair vessel hailing out from Boston Harbor on her maiden voyage, failed to perceive the lighthouse's frantic signals from ashore to turn back and head once more into the safe waters of the open sea. For whatever reason, such entreaties went unheeded, and the Cadiz went sharply aground upon some hidden jut of land concealed by high tide and undetected by all hands upon the deck. A sudden fog was offered by way of an explanation for the misadventure, but all told, some 15 hands, the captain and 2 seasoned officers, and all 15 passengers aboard went into the sea, and the Cadiz herself went down to her final resting place beneath the cold, dark waves. Of the lost, all but 3 washed later upon those saddened shores, bloated, their flesh torn asunder and utterly bereft of life. The 3 souls claimed by the sea included my wife, of whom no trace was found. I bore my grief as best I could, and the funeral service was well attended by many friends and colleagues from Miskatonic University, where I held a comfortable and secure post in that venerable institution's research library, and where my wife herself had recently attained the august position of chief librarian in the antiquarian stacks. I had much to consider in the management of my grief, and kept its expression under the strictest control, for as good fortune would have it, my wife and I had been blessed with a young son, just 9 years of age at the season of his mother's passage from life into precious memory. He was a quiet and taciturn lad, was my Obadiah, a sickly, delicate boy, but I vowed not to unnecessarily burden him with the weight of my grief, as he struggled to shoulder his own. We endured in silence for the most part, and so the time passed slowly, and I succumbed all too easily before the languid pretense that all was well with the lad, and with myself. That is, until the 1-year anniversary of that sad and miserable day that had cast us both, father and son, forever adrift as surely as it had the beautiful woman who had filled our days with laughter and merriment. I was startled awake in my bed that morning by a loud crash, when the limb of an ancient elm tore by a mighty gale had come bursting through one of the windows on the ground floor. Phillips, my manservant, was already taking stock of things when I gained the parlor, and paused in shock as I beheld the damage. I hesitated for only a moment, surrendering matters into Philip's capable hands, and went in search of my son, who had yet to appear. He was nowhere to be found, but upon a closer examination of his rooms, I made a curious and confounding discovery. On the table beside Obadiah's bed lay a heavily carved bronze box, its lid thrown back and several items strewn carelessly across the bed, and my son was nowhere to be seen. I recognized this box as the solitary gift my wife had bequeathed our son in the event of her death. I had no knowledge of the box's contents and had always respected this small privacy between mother and son. I knew only that the box was to remain sealed until the event of the 1-year anniversary of her passing. I did not know if the box's entire contents were still here, or if the lad had secreted something upon his person before departing for unknown destinations. The days spent searching the house and village for some hint of what might have happened to Obadiah yield nothing but a growing mystery, and the fear that the ravenous talons of the tragique macabre were once again making merry upon the sad entrails of my dwindling family. I set about reviewing the contents of the box when a single object of immediate interest caught my eye. A hefty leather-bound journal fashioned of an unknown mottled green hide, its title in the gold and twisted script of delicate drifting coils and many elongated flourishes. What was particularly of note about this journal, before ever I opened its densely illustrated and annotated pages, was this. I had absolutely no idea that my wife kept such a tome, or to what purpose, but one clearly kept hidden and secreted away from mine own prying eyes. I sat down upon Obadiah's bed, and it was not until eventide and the tall gaunt shadows gathered closely around me in eager anticipation that my head cleared, and I set aside Lydia's journal and returned once more to the world at hand. The book was an intoxicating and heady revelation of staggering import that threw a long and much-needed light into the silent, dusky corners and forbidden hallways of my wife's family history and the whole of our life together since first we had met. Though in some elder script I could still glean the nature and import of its contents from my work at Miskatonic. The relevance of this book for my poor child, however, rocked me to my very soul. Within the hour I had packed a small valise, tucked the journal into my coat pocket, and then made my way to the port. There I booked passage northward on the only vessel that would have me at such a late notice, and with no thought for my own comfort, for I knew with certain conviction to what destination my son had embarked. The shrouded city of his mother's birth and family line. Lydia had understandably concealed this legacy from me, but she had made provision to bestow it fully upon her only son and heir. Thus did I set forth that night upon the decks of the merchant schooner Dagon's Folly. She was an ancient barnacle-encrusted vessel, decrepit to the mast and laden heavy as a pregnant whale with the foul reek of rotten timbers and oozing barrels of fetid oil. But she was the only ship in the coastal fleet that made port in Innsmouth. The voyage of just 2 days seemed to linger on for a lifetime. The crew, some 5 hands, and the captain and his mate kept themselves to themselves and below decks much of the time, which suited me very well. They were a shambling lot, swathed in their greatcoats against the hailing blows of salt and sea, their faces concealed by damp, grimy rags. They spoke nary a word to me, not even the captain. But when chance or the demands of the voyage brought us into close proximity, they turned sharply away and scuttled off as quickly as they could to some task. But I caught snippets of deep, hoarse laughter as I passed them by, and passed them by as quickly as I could, I most assuredly did. All night long I was tormented by the guttural chirping of their ribald sea shanties, which partook of no tongue I had a familiarity with, and brought to mind no human tongue at all. The grunts and cries of what I hoped was no more than their enthusiastic feasting almost drove me mad. And when in my cabin I always barred the door with whatever was at hand to keep that detestable crew at bay. Many times I heard the rusted door handle of my cabin rattling, followed by laughter and obscene chittering. I lingered on deck as little as possible during the light of day, even though the crew kept their cabins until nightfall. The decks were always damp and slippery with a green ooze, and moss and seaweed hung from the masts and sails like Spanish moss in the deepest bayou. This solitude afforded me ample time to spend in my quarters, such as they were, studying Lydia's journal. These quarters were nothing but a tiny storage hold with a foul-smelling mat flung onto the floor for me to sleep on. I reposed instead upon the bare, cold floor, when at odd and irregular moments I was overtaken by a restless and furtive sleep. My wife's journal was a thing of curious wonder, born of a strange and alien beauty upon coarse parchment the color of amber, and covered over with a cacophony of exquisite calligraphic script. Illustrations and illuminated miniatures galore, and portraits of absolutely fantastical beings out of legend poured from every page, all strung together with the glyphs and sigils and ciphers of the archmage, and the unmistakable signs and seals of the recalcitrant blasphemer. That the creatures and people inhabiting these pages resembled nothing of this earth gave me only the briefest pause. For truth be told, there were certain ancient volumes in the elder stacks at Miskatonic University Library that openly conveyed to interested researchers the full history of such beings and their hidden secret strongholds and byways among us. These legends and my wife's journal confirmed one central and critical fact most germane to my own life as it unraveled before me. Lydia herself hailed from this strange lineage, with its deepest roots in the dying seaport of Innsmouth. It was clearly to Innsmouth that our son Obadiah had ventured forth to find his family. So it was with trepidation and a great sigh of relief when I finally set foot on Innsmouth's rotten port. Beginning what sad misadventure I could not guess, but at least glad to be parting company forever with that crew of miscreants of the high seas aboard Dagon's Folly. I vowed I would crawl on broken and bloodied hands and knees or swim back to New York rather than book a return passage on that accursed vessel. When we had docked, all hands, the captain and his mate, in company with a swarm of things that were vomited up from the hold, strange man-like creatures, hunched and drooling, poured onto the city streets like a plague of rats, only to disappear much too quickly from sight into the crumbling warehouses and festering public houses that lined the dilapidated quays. I was left engulfed in a foreboding silence that swallowed me as I stood there pondering my first visions of Innsmouth. The town loomed dark and dismal before me, haughty and accusing as death itself. The whole of it sprang from a series of low hills like some nocturnal blooming fungi, its crown upon a ragged peak topped with an ancient crumbling cathedral, a single pale light in its belfry. I saw then it was no house of the holy, but rather a house of grotesque and monumental proportions. The entire vision unfolding before me seemed fashioned by some preternatural hand from a single miasmatic substance from an elder geologic epoch, and I wondered briefly at the manner of folk who had settled here so long ago, and from what distant shores had they hailed. I wandered in a daze through Innsmouth's warren of silent, gnarled streets, the spectral house reigning crown-like atop its central peak my only guide. That stately abode beckoned imperviously, demanding that I approach as though I were nothing more than an adorned subject bowing before the throne. The streets and shops were oddly deserted, bleak and shuttered as if against an impending storm. If the place did not tremble with a secret furtive vitality, I would have it down as abandoned, and devoid of all life as it stood silent and awaited the final ravages of time. I climbed those twisted streets and alleys higher and higher as if I would ascend to the very portal of heaven itself and the stars beyond. House after house of every possible size, shape, and description, all of them decrepit and hearkening to centuries long past, crowded countless narrow streets. These abodes seemed to glare menacingly as I passed among them. Shop and smithy, public house great and small, their signs swinging in the gentle breeze. Even the constable's guard shack lay unattended. Not even a solitary tabby patrolled its turf, suspicious of this stranger parading uninvited through the center of town, wending his way toward that bleak and man-inspired peak of faded Gothic splendor as it gazed down upon all lesser creation below. When finally I stood before the house of my wife's ancestors atop its clouded pinnacle, I gasped in utter shock. For here, huddled tightly around the house in ordered rows, filling the yard and spilling out into the dusty streets beyond, were the inhabitants of Innsmouth. Homeowners, ragged merchants and aged cobblers, tinkers, beggars, and even a few constables in their faded blue greatcoats, all gathered around the house where they held silent vigil, as hushed as any tomb. I moved along the throng, pressing against the mass of gathered bodies, but not one of them paid me the slightest heed. When I had finally taken stock of things, the house seemed not of this world at all, but rather like a dream woven of dust and cobwebs and moonbeams, and all such things as compel the mind's eye to gaze upon hidden forests and forbidden glades where thoughts hide and frolic to whisper among the shadows. I reached the broad staircase to the house and found it quite real, though again not a single hand raised to bar my entry to my own dead wife's ancestral manse, and into which without preamble or delay I quickly gained entrance. While I still had seen no evidence that my son Obadiah had reached the dismal seaport quays of Innsmouth, or found his mother's moldering childhood home, or discovered any remaining familial contacts, the house was indeed a thing of monstrous grandeur that left me tingling in fear and delight. As I stood in the grand foyer, my eyes were naturally drawn upwards to the only light which cascaded down from a dozen windows lining the central open spire that twisted as an open chasm many stories above my head, terminating like a gnarled and pointed finger stabbing accusingly at the heavens. A flood of glittering dust danced within the golden light and filled the great hall with the specter of fairy life. I noticed then the regal staircase that climbed the wall to my right, and without pause I ascended through floor after floor of salons, elegant dressing rooms, and stately bedchambers, many obviously uninhabited and empty, but for a lifetime of dust and decay and the leavings of rodents and threadbare tapestries. Other chambers clearly held the secrets of much more recent occupancy. It was on the uppermost floor beneath that grim spire that I made the first discovery. It was in a suite of rooms furnished as an alchemist's lair, containing crumbling worm-eaten tomes without number lining the walls, and beakers, bottles, jars, and decanters of all shapes and colors, and a vast panoply of fantastical machines, devices, gizmos, and gadgets, hoses and wires whose purpose I did not wish to even fathom a guess. There was also a small pile of carefully folded clothing and a fine coat, all belonging to my son Obadiah. I called out to the boy, but was met with a silence so complete it seemed ready to suck the very breath from my lungs. I returned to the grand foyer, seeing no reason to explore the highest and most desolate peak of the spire just yet. I had not seen Obadiah among the throng crowding the front yard, so I decided to see if there was perhaps a basement or root cellar. On the ground floor, I discovered an identical grand staircase lost almost completely in the gloom that coiled its way down into the very bowels of earth beneath the house. I could swear upon my immortal soul that no such staircase had been there when I first entered the manse. Yet here it was, no less a thing of splendor than its counterpart. I could think of nothing but to grab a candlebroom from a nearby table and light it from a pair of flickering sconces that lay to either side of the staircase, themselves having seemingly just materialized as well. But before I could descend the very first step, a great gong rang overhead that threatened to rock the house to its foundations. To my great dismay, I heard the sound of huge shutters being flung open within the highest reaches of the wicked spire, followed by the flapping of leathern wings like those of hideous preternatural bats. This gave way to the front doors bursting open, and all the people of Innsmouth flooded into the house as on a tide flowing silently down the grand staircase to whatever mysteries lay concealed beneath my feet. The townsfolk seemed carried upon a gust of mighty wind, and I was forced to grab onto the marble banister for my very life to avoid being swept off my feet and borne asunder. As quickly as the tide appeared, it had passed me by, and I stood once more gazing into that abysmal chasm. I steadied my resolve and quickly descended into the darkness, the meager light of the candlebroom my only but most welcome companion. I descended floor after floor, wherein a verse and duplicate of the house bore deeply into the earth. A tumultuous roar from the stairwell and a throbbing cadence of many hundreds of voices rose in discordant song and chant triumphant, accompanied by a beating of drums that echoed the thunderous pounding within my own chest. Heavy oily tendrils of noxious incense borne upon other vile and odious fumes wafted from below, bringing to mind the charnel house. I longed to run back to the light of a wholesome day, but I could not without discovering the fate of my son, and wresting him from whatever fiends had taken him. So I ventured forth, downward into the darkness, submerged into that unknowable chasm. If not without fear, at least bolstered by the need to find my son. The bottom of the staircase fanned out like the mouth of a great antediluvian conch and emptied into an amphitheater hewn from the rock. Its rough vaulted ceiling disappeared into mist that rose from a grotto filled with effervescent green waters that frothed wildly and lapped upon dead shores. All was lit from below by some source I could not see. The incessant dripping of luminescent ooze from 1,000 gnarled stalactites provided yet another fiendish cadence, accompanying the echoes of the throng dancing off the tabernacle walls. All the denizens of Innsmouth knelt reverently before a crude stone altar, and a throne some 20 feet in height, upon which sat a twisted creature, spawned of legend within the depths of depraved madness. The fiend possessed gigantic leathern wings and a heaving muscular body, a bilious and unholy melange of creatures born of both land and sea. The thing bore a ghastly visage resplendent with a writhing mass of appendages like those of the giant octopus or colossal squid, and I marveled at the behemoth's loathsome grandeur, its body more than 15 feet in height. The faces of the townspeople came more clearly into view as I grew accustomed to a darkness broken only by flickering candles and the luminescent glow of the grotto, and I shuddered in disgust. Broad, fleshy lips trembled in silent worship, while large, unblinking eyes gazed in rapture at the altar. The hairless pates and sickly green pallor were those of the Deep Ones, creatures I had believed to be nothing more than the rantings of fevered imaginations of the fiends of the opium pit. My shock was tempered by what I had gleaned from the pages of my wife's journal, for here before me crouched and capered every possible configuration of monstrosity. Some looked merely like unfortunate misshapen humans with their weak but trachean features, while others bore evidence of this lineage in such flagrant fullness that they could never hope to walk along any street save those of Innsmouth. Still others frolicked and cavorted unclothed in the waters of that noxious grotto which clearly gave passage to the sea, and allowed these later supplicants to attend this open celebration of every known blasphemy. The drums beat on, their malign cadence rattling my very bones. Yet still no hand moved to throw me out of this unholy tabernacle. I might have been invisible to them, except when they stepped aside and made room for me to move among them, towards the altar and the thing in all its glory enthroned upon it. What compelled me toward that daze was the two figures that appeared from out the mists as regal and robed officiants and commanded my gaze. One was an inhumanly tall, proud, and willow-thinned creature, clad in flowing diaphanous sea-green robes, and crowned with a diadem of gems that twinkled like the stars in the heavens, its face concealed behind a heavy veil. The other figure was that of a small boy, my son Obadiah, standing proud and unafraid before the altar, unbound, unfettered, and clearly of his own free will. I gazed then more closely at the tall crowned figure as the veil fell away and the face of my wife Lydia appeared. Transformed beyond imagination, yet unmistakably, she now fully fledged into the terrible inheritance of her familial line. I nearly collapsed in a paroxysm of insanity, as my mind grappled for safer shores of disquietude than this. There she stood, her large unblinking eyes and broad mouth ennobled by something neither Batrachian nor human that defined the deepest secrets of her ancestral line. Before her stood her son, my son, her prince and heir, as he was being presented to his liege. A thing far older than this small rock in space where simple folk like myself had made our home for not so very long at all. I stood in terrible awe, my feet as if grown from the rock beneath me, forbidding any attempt to flee. What would be the point? The smallest knot upon these creatures could overpower me and consign me at their leisure to whatever watery subterranean burial they saw fit. I realized suddenly, as if startled awake from some endless dream, that I was moving faster and faster toward that enraptured tripartite officiant body. The tall figure of my wife bowed in obeisance before that abysmal throne as she presented our son as an offering, whereupon the behemoth stroked Obadiah's face with a slimy tentacle and unfurled its mighty wings. I lunged toward the altar. The throng surrounded me as a sea of limpid, damp hands brushed my face and body as I passed among them, not to forbid me, but to partake of me in some hideous way that made me shudder and twist away violently from their softly probing ministrations. Lydia turned finally toward me, her face unreadable in its rictus gaze of dread majesty, a high and royal priestess in state before her lord. I then beheld Obadiah's face more clearly. The sickly pallor that had plagued the lad since birth had burned away in the blaze of triumphant rapture he now attained. His face shone with a strange light, and his large lidless eyes and broad lips smiled upon me, the flickering of recognition plain for all to see. I was his father, but I quavered before that gaze and feared what fate awaited me in the coming moments. Each moment an eon frozen in timeless amber, each breath a world that came into being then faded into the timeless starless void from which eternity is born. I shut my eyes tight and surrendered to that against which I could not offer the least resistance nor defense. A hand shook me roughly and my eyes shot open. It was Phillips, my manservant, waking me with a tray containing my morning repast. I jumped up and looked around. A dream? Had I only been dreaming of those foreboding caverns and the dark abominations cavorting within? Had I but dreamed of my wife and son? Was I mad, utterly stark raving mad, having never left my home but having succumbed to some delirium? Imagined it all? Phillips dispelled that nonsense with a few words that left me even more ponderous than before. He had been making his rounds through the house that morning, as was his custom in my absence, and happening past my chamber, he heard me snoring. He had gone to tell cook to prepare my breakfast, then returned to wake me for the day, having absolutely no idea when or under what means I had returned home. In this we were in agreement, for I had no idea how I had been delivered back to my bedchamber, when but a moment ago I was standing in that blighted subterranean tabernacle. Availing myself of much-needed refreshment, and attempting to take stock of things, I noticed a small book on my nightstand. Picking it up, I saw it was my wife's journal, her grimoire, an account of a royal family of semi-human Batrachian deep ones, who lived and worked among us unseen, unsuspected, and upon what dark calling, what mission in this world of humanity I dared not speculate. I opened the journal, and an envelope inscribed with a delicate and familiar hand fell into my lap. I hesitated a moment, just staring at it. When I finally gathered my wits and read what lay upon those pages, I knew that my comfortable though grief-filled life was at an end. Nothing would ever be the same again, for as is said, one cannot unknow a thing. Whatever might befall me, I had most definitely been summoned, but also given the right of refusal should my mind and wits prove too frail of constitution to stoutly answer the demands of the unknown, the unknowable. The next day I broke a firm vow I had taken under the strictest oath just one short week ago, and found myself once again upon the slimy, foul-smelling decks of Dagon's Folly, heading north under full sail and a light breeze toward the final port of call in her itinerary of shadowy destinations, Innsmouth. There I would have no recourse but to surrender and submit fully to an unspeakably horrifying, yet irresistible offer from my wife.
Let me start by telling you something about me. The most important thing, in fact. I find things, and I fix them. That's who I am. If you don't know that, you don't know me. I'm a second-generation auto mechanic, born and bred. I've been repairing cars since before Ford Pintos were blowing up, when cars were made of steel, and Route 66 wasn't just something for the cartoons. These days, I'm fortunate enough to own a shop downtown, between two of those chain coffee places. It's small, sure, but it has a reputation for saving cars so far gone no one else will even touch them. So, if you live in the area and you've ever been stuck with the sourest of lemons, or maybe your kid drove your minivan into the pool, we just might have crossed paths, you and I. The reputation is what led to me getting a phone call from a guy I'd never met, saying he had something that might interest me. His name was Bert, and he'd apparently just purchased a piece of property that sat unowned for the better part of 20 years. I knew of the area he was talking about. It's out in the hills, where there isn't much to look at. Most of the land there went to weed years ago. Acres and acres of old woods and burnt-down barns just waiting for nobody in particular to see the value in them. And, well, it seems Bert was that nobody in particular. I honestly didn't know what Bert's purchase had to do with me, and told him just that, figuring he must have had the wrong number. But the next words out of his mouth told me he knew exactly who he was talking to. Apparently, when old Bert started walking around his new property, digging around in the dirt, so to speak, he made an interesting discovery. So interesting, in fact, that it got me to grab my keys, hop in my truck, and drive up into the hills without so much as a pause to wash my hands. Some things, you see, don't wait for a man to look presentable. As I drove up into the hills to meet Bert, I started to think about my father and the drives he used to take me on. He liked to get a feel for whichever car he was working on, and those drives, they always ended with a detour into the hills. Nothing tests a vehicle like elevation, he used to say, and I have to admit I still agree with that statement. All those long inclines, sharp turns, and fast descents, not to mention the occasional slam on the brakes, really put a car through its paces. Dad knew a thing or two about cars, even if he knew nothing about how to raise a family, other than maybe a slight fear of commitment. The main thing I got from my father was a passion for restoring old cars in my spare time. It's a hobby of mine, and I do it in the garage at my house. I'm especially a sucker for rare cars, and the rarer the better. That little hobby of mine, more so than my day business, was why I ended up driving out to the middle of nowhere with dirty hands and a head full of ideas. The road up was just as long and winding as I remembered. I almost missed the entrance for the property, a hidden driveway marked with little more than a broken mailbox and a rotting signpost. The private road got smaller and smaller by the minute until I swore the trees were going to swallow me whole and spit the bones back out. When I finally reached what could pass for a clearing, a guy with a face like a junkyard dog was waiting for me next to the newest, cleanest Ford pickup I'd seen outside of a dealership. He introduced himself to me as Eddie, an associate of old Bert. I told him I'd been expecting to meet Bert himself, but Eddie explained that Bert didn't like to meet new people and rarely came out in the cold weather. It was a bit raw, I had to admit, so I dropped the whole thing and let Eddie get down to the business at hand. We left our cars behind, and Eddie led me into the woods, where the walking was slow going on account of the overgrowth of vines and dead branches. I'm not one to spook easily, but the more we walked, the creepier those woods got, until I was fairly sure Eddie was going to use that French Mastiff face of his to tear my throat out. But just when I was thinking about turning back and saying screw it to the whole thing, I caught sight of what we'd come for through the trees. The very first car I saw was a white 1974 Pontiac Trans Am. It was missing its door and tires, and it was buried under a layer of dead vines, but the body shape was unmistakable. Under the rust, I could even see what was left of the telltale Firebird emblazoned across its hood in blue. I couldn't believe a car like that was just sitting out in the middle of the woods, waiting for anyone to come along and find it. As I got closer, though, I saw just how bad the condition of the car was. The insides were rotted out from rain and mold, and the floor was so eaten up by rust it was ready to fall out. Before my brain could process the loss of such a beautiful machine, I caught sight of another car. This one was a Datsun 210 with a tree growing right through the hole where its trunk used to be. Wet leaves and newspaper filled the back seat, and the dashboard was an abandoned nest that crawled with leggy insects. Old Bert hadn't been pulling my leg. Those woods were a graveyard for abandoned cars. From what I could tell, about 3 acres of woods were absolutely littered with the corpses of old autos. Some were in pieces. Most were covered in dead leaves and rust and all the other things that happen when anything is left outside for years and years. But they were there. The sight of so many classic cars in one place, virtually unknown to anyone, both excited and saddened me. For close to an hour, I walked around random piles of tires and glass to stare at rusted-out Range Rovers and Jeeps with their headlights hanging out like popped eyeballs. Finally, like I'd woken up from a spell, I asked Eddie what Bert expected from me. And that's when he told me the strangest, most interesting offer he could have told me in that moment. He said if I could make every single one of those cars disappear in 3 days' time, at no cost to old Bert, I could keep them. The words nearly knocked me off my feet. I'd have to call in every favor to every salvage yard and tow truck operator I knew, but it was possible. Still, nearly all of the cars I'd seen were beyond repair, even for a guy like me. At most, I saw some parts that could be salvaged. Maybe a few of the newer, less damaged ones could be saved. I knew a few guys in my circle who might be interested, and I figured if I played my cards right, I could make a few bucks out of the deal to boot. Or at least land a good trade or two. Still, there weren't any cars that I was interested in for myself. Until, at the edge of the property, tucked away in a spot I'd nearly overlooked, I saw it. It was as if I'd been drawn to it, like I was meant to find it. The car was familiar looking, yet like nothing I'd ever seen. Cross a Chevelle Malibu Classic SE with the modern retro feel of the '97 Plymouth Prowler, add the large rear spoiler and flared wheel arches of a '99 Nissan Skyline GTR, and you still won't come close. It looked like something one of the big 3 manufacturers had made, and yet I'd never seen or heard of its like ever before. It had no logos, no hood ornament, no identification of any kind. I practically ran around to the back of it to look for a name, a logo, something to identify it, tripping over hidden rocks and broken glass to do it. but there was nothing. Nothing to betray the make and mark of the strange car in front of me. I even asked Eddie if he knew what it was. He only shrugged, clearly wanting to wrap up our little outdoor meeting. I half-heartedly agreed. It was later than I'd realized. Between the dwindling sun and the discovery I'd made, I started to get a chill I couldn't shake. I had a bad tooth I'd been neglecting, and even that was starting to hurt from the cold. So I agreed to burn steel. I shook Eddie's hand on it and got out of there, giving one last glance at the strange car in the woods on the way out. The next day, after making more phone calls than a politician on election night, a swarm of flatbeds, wheel lifts, and salvage trucks descended on those woods. For 2 days, they scooped out every piece of metal and glass in the place, while I oversaw the operation like a choir conductor from hell. I directed trucks this way and cutting crews that way. They snipped and cut and tore out every dead tree standing in the way so the truck crews could do the rest. I even got in there myself with the old chainsaw when it was needed. It was an exhausting 2 days, but I managed to keep my word to Bert and clear every abandoned car off his property with about an hour to spare. Some of the cars went to the junkyards, others to various garages I'd made arrangements with. I was dead on my feet by the time I got home. I was ready for a shower and a bed. In what order, I wasn't sure. And yet a crackle of energy went through me when I saw what had been dropped off in my garage. My mystery car. Without the shadows of the woods hiding it, I could see it had been painted silver before the rust took over. It had been a fast sucker once, like a bullet to a werewolf's chest. That had been a long time ago. And yet, I sensed there was still some life in the old girl. I wanted so badly to start digging around under the hood to see what I could find out about it, but my legs were ready to collapse, and my eyes could barely focus. Intending to wake up early and hit the garage, I stumbled off to bed. You know that feeling you get when you realize someone's been talking to you for the past minute, thinking you've been listening, and you only just figured it out? Yeah, it's the feeling I woke up to. I sat straight up, like a vampire rising from his coffin. My bedroom was still dark, which meant it was the middle of the night. In my half-sleep, I tried to make out the clock on my nightstand, but couldn't read the numbers. So, I fumbled for my glasses and shoved them on. It was just past 2 in the morning. Way too early, even for me. No way was I getting up. Strange feeling or no. I was about to take my glasses off and lay back down when I heard the reason I'd woken up. Whispering. A man was in my room, whispering in the dark. I lunged across my bed and turned on the lamp, nearly knocking it over. I didn't have a weapon, but if I could see the intruder, I could do something about it. I spun back to the whispering, to see who it was, to shout at them or jump on them. Whatever I had to do to save my life from the psycho in my bedroom. But the room was empty. Just me and a pounding heart. I was so confused. I jumped out of bed and tore around the room, making sure no one was hiding, but I didn't find anyone. I was alone. Then I heard it again, and I knew. The whispers were coming from down the hall. With bare feet, I followed it, trying to make out what it was saying, but it was too low to understand. I grabbed a knife as I passed through the kitchen and held it in front of me with sweat beading on my face, despite how cold I kept the house. I followed the whispering to the garage. The overhead light flickered on, lighting up the strange car in my garage. In my half-sleep, half-terror, I'd nearly forgotten about it. But there it was, like a bear hibernating in its cave, waiting for the end of winter. It felt alive somehow. Not dead, just asleep and dreaming. And it was whispering. I knew how crazy that sounded, how crazy that was. But I swallowed hard and approached the car, knife first. The blade shook in front of me. The whispering got louder the closer I got, and yet I still couldn't understand the words it was saying. Was someone hiding inside the car? Had I inherited a homeless man when I'd had it towed to my house? If so, I had to get him out of there. Get him help, sure, make sure he had a place to sleep, but he couldn't stay in my garage, whispering through the night. No way. With my free hand, I yanked on the driver's side door. It didn't open. Rusted shut. I slowly walked around to the passenger side and yanked again. It opened. The whispering was louder now. Louder, but not clearer. Like an old television tuned between channels, like a frequency not being picked up. Like a radio. The whispers were coming from the radio. I laughed under my breath, realizing how ridiculous I'd been. But then I remembered there was no way the radio could be working. The car wasn't turned on. If it even had a battery under the hood, it was probably little more than a square pile of rust and battery acid. I clutched the kitchen knife tight, and with the other hand, I slowly reached out to turn the volume knob. I needed to know if the whispers were coming from the radio, and if they were, I needed to know what they were saying. My temple throbbed as the whispers grew louder and louder, louder and louder, louder. The moment my finger touched the knob, the whispers stopped. I felt like I was going crazy. I looked around the inside of the car, noting the strong smell of mildew and animal with a tinge of rotten leather. Other than my own breath echoing back at me, it was silent. No whispers. No nothing. I went back to bed, but I barely slept. The next day was the day I usually took off from the shop, which was a relief since I woke up almost as tired as when I'd gone to bed. As I ate my breakfast the night before, still sat fresh in my mind, but the more I went over it, the more I thought it had to have been a bad dream, brought on by exhaustion and an imagination run wild. I had to admit the mystery car sitting in my garage had gotten my mind racing faster than a Formula One. I'm the kind of guy who likes a simple explanation, something I can touch and feel and, yes, fix. So I started to think that I could have picked up some kind of rogue radio transmission from a trucker, or even a passing plane. The police scanner I owned in my younger days had certainly picked up its share of random broadcasts, and when it comes to working on junkers, I've learned to expect the unexpected. After I'd eaten my breakfast and downed my coffee, I got right to work on the car. I wanted to clear the air of whatever had happened, and I was dying to see what that baby had going on under the hood. The mystery of who the hell had made the thing was still heavy on me, but the enigma only deepened the more I looked. Under all that rust and dirt and oil, I couldn't find one damn mark that told me who'd made the car. I almost wanted to say it was a custom build, but the work was just too precise. The system too well planned out to be an aftermarket job. I worked on it all day, so wrapped up in it I forgot to eat lunch. I ate dinner like a raccoon digging through a dumpster. Then, I worked on it some more. I was just crawling into bed when I heard it again. The whispering. This time, I ignored it, hoping it would go away on its own. But it didn't stop. Not until I got up, walked across my house, went into the garage, and touched the radio. Then, it stopped. I decided right then and there not to go to the shop the next day. There was just too much work to be done. I'd been working on the car for 4 days straight before I got it started up. 4 days of stripping and cleaning and rebuilding, 4 nights of whispering, I was even starting to hear it during the day, but low, barely audible, like a television playing somewhere in the house. After I got the engine started, the first thing I did was pull my code reader down from my tool wall and hook it up to the dashboard input. I'd been pleasantly surprised to find an input on the car, even though I was fairly certain it had been built after '96. To my shock, the screen filled up with a bunch of random trouble codes I'd never seen before, then went blank. I tried to get it powered up again, but apparently the connection had completely overloaded the device. I'd had the reader for years, and it had never given me a problem. I put it down and got back to the car, deciding to stick to the old-fashioned way and get a feel for what was wrong with it, just like Dad used to do. With my foot on the gas, I revved the engine good. It sounded better than I'd expected, like a beast waking up from deep sleep. But there was also something rattling around under the hood, something loose, knocking around inside the carburetor, or possibly even the manifold. I tried a few options, opening up this and that, until I narrowed it down to something completely unexpected: the transmission. With considerable force, I managed to open up the transmission, and sure enough, I found something inside. Something dark and red. I pulled it out and studied it under the light. It looked like a small rock, covered in old transmission fluid. How it got in there, I didn't have a clue, but I decided to clean it off and get a better look at it, in case it pointed to a bigger problem. As I walked it to the slop sink, I noticed the whispering, usually a dull static during the day, had started to grow louder. I could almost make out individual words now, but I ignored it and ran the small rock under the faucet, watching the dark red fluid swirl down the drain. That was when I discovered something I was not prepared for, not in the slightest. The thing in my hand wasn't a rock. It was a tooth. A human tooth. The whispers had grown so loud I could barely hear myself think, barely feel the disgust rising in the pit of my stomach. With the whispers practically shouting in my ear, I dropped the tooth and it bounced and clattered inside the sink, coming to a rest near the edge of the drain. The whispers grew quiet again, a dull roar tickling at the back of my skull. I stared at it. The tooth in the sink. The impossible tooth from the impossible car. I had the urge to throw it out, to get it out of my house and never see it again. But I didn't do that. I couldn't tell you why not. Maybe because that meant touching it again. Maybe something else. Feeling like I should give the car a rest, I worked on getting my code reader working again. Otherwise, I'd have to run to the store and buy a new one. I changed out the batteries and gave it a good solid whack. A few seconds later, I was happy to see the screen turn on. I thought I'd have to do a factory reset to use it again, but I was surprised to find it worked perfectly fine. Not only that, the trouble codes it had read off the car were still stored in its memory. There were pages and pages of codes like I'd never seen in my life, more than I think are even in the tool's programming. In fact, I couldn't find a single one of them anywhere in the manual. I figured they were probably just random numbers, and yet, there was something strange about them, like they had a pattern to them. I dusted off my old computer and typed in the problem codes, figuring if I could get a better look at them, I might be able to figure out their meaning. If not, I could at least print them out and show them to somebody who could. After 20 minutes, I barely made a dent in typing up all the codes. I gave up on the idea that I could copy them all. I pushed away from my computer and stood up, rubbing my eyes from the strain. Between the glare of the old screen and the noise in my ears, my head was killing me. It all felt so pointless, so inconsequential. Just before I shut the computer down, I happened to glance one last time at the screen. And when I did, I noticed something that made my skin go cold. The codes, the pattern, the numbers and letters and spaces between them. They were starting to form a face. A human face, with 2 eyes, and screaming. I shut the computer down as fast as I could, then unplugged it to be safe. Then I marched to the garage and disconnected the radio, practically ripping it out of the car. The whispers stopped. The house was quiet. But not for long. For 3 days, I told myself to get rid of that car, to tow it out of my garage and dump it somewhere no one could find it. Maybe even drench it in gasoline and light a match. For 3 days, I ignored the whispers and the doorbell and the phone calls from my shop asking when I was coming back. For 3 days, I buried my head under the hood and worked and worked and worked. On the 4th day, when the whispers in the radio had grown louder than my own thoughts, louder but still unclear, still without words I could understand, I lost it. I threw my wrench at the tool wall, knocking down chisels and socket wrenches and a dozen other tools sent clattering to the ground. I pounded on my ears, cursing them, willing them to go deaf and stop hearing the whispers. But they didn't stop hearing, and the whispers didn't stop. So I decided that if I couldn't stop hearing them, I at least needed to know what they were saying. I went back to the slop sink. The tooth was still there, perched near the edge of the drain. I prayed for it to slip down and wash away on its own, but there it was, round and sharp and real as ever. So I picked it up, and the whispers grew louder, clearer, but still not clear enough to hear, not enough to make out what the radio was saying, to understand what it wanted from me. It was like a broken antenna, only turning in half the frequency. The garage was a mess. I was a mess. Rancid grease stains everywhere, a hole in my tool wall where the wrench had struck it, the ground littered with hammers and screwdrivers and pliers. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed the pliers from the ground, shoved them into my mouth, got a good hold of my bad tooth, and ripped it out. It was easier than I expected, but it still hurt, and it bled a lot. But I didn't hesitate. I pushed the tooth I'd found in the transmission into its place. The moment I did, it was as if everything came into focus, as if the radio was inside my skull. No, as if my skull was the radio, and I was the antenna. I could hear the transmission clear as day now, a man's voice inside my head, whispering to me, telling me where to find the rest of him. I told you all of this not because I expect you to believe me, but because I'm about to walk out my door and do something I might not come back from. And if that's the case, if I don't return today or any other day from this thing I need to do, I want people to know why. Because I find things and I fix them. If you don't know that, you don't know me.
Day 1, October 2069. The week started out like most, sitting at my desk in a cubicle, sipping coffee, and attempting to concentrate despite the constant din of other federal investigators in their adjacent spaces speaking loudly on their phones. My name is Ryan Powers. I'm one of 3 FBI agents scattered around the country who make up the Division of Temporal Integrity. Basically, I'm a time cop. A decade ago, a few eggheads in the physics department at Caltech worked out the mechanics of time travel. Apparently, this development scared the crap out of politicians in Washington, because the same year they announced it, the United States Congress passed a law making it a federal crime to make a jump into the past without prior authorization and strict supervision. The scientists told Congress traveling into the future was impossible. I guarantee you, someday, someone will figure out how to get there. As you can imagine, politicians were scared of someone manipulating the past and robbing them of their highly lucrative and cushy jobs. Thus, the Watkins-Morgan Act of 2060. This law made it a crime to initiate an unauthorized jump to the past. Think about it for a moment. If someone traveled to the past and changed it, how would you know? The whole cause and effect thing will drive you crazy, if you let it. I try not to. But since I have an advanced degree in physics and sorta kinda understand how time travel works, they chose me as one of the individuals they recruited. Once I became an agent, the FBI moved me to the West Coast to investigate possible violations of the Watkins-Morgan law. On this particular Monday morning, the special agent in charge of our Los Angeles office, Lucas Flores, stopped by my desk and asked, "What are you working on this week, Powers?" I hesitated in answering his loaded question. Nothing good ever comes from these types of inquiries. I looked up at him. A few critical follow-ups. Why? "The director wants you to drop everything and check out Time Lane, Inc. The Bureau's received several inside tips they are conducting illegal jumps. Plus, he's got Senator Morgan breathing down his neck about making sure time travel is squelched." I thought Time Lane was one of the few corporations allowed to do research. They are, but if the company is conducting unlawful experiments, their charter will be pulled and the CEO arrested. A bad feeling swept over me about the assignment. After a lengthy pause, I mumbled, "What's the address?" He handed me a signed subpoena and an old-fashioned handwritten note. I looked up again. "This is near the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena." "Yeah, I noticed that. Have fun." A little history about Reed Manley, CEO of Time Lane Incorporated. He is one of the original physicists who figured out the procedure for time travel. I met him at a symposium 7 years ago when the agency first proposed the Temporal Integrity Division. His passion for the research put him in stiff opposition to the views of the government. When they signed the Watkins-Morgan law, he resigned from Caltech and started Time Lane. How he acquired the capital to start the company so fast is still a mystery. I can speculate, as did Wall Street, but no one provided proof. I arrived at the 30-story Time Lane building at 11 a.m. The reception desk android scanned my credentials and said in a sexy female voice, "Thank you, Agent Powers. Please wait for someone to escort you." I nodded and retrieved my ID. Standing with my hands behind my back, I surveyed the reception atrium. Reaching to the 7th floor, the openness of the area could only be described as high-dollar architecture. Original Andy Warhols, Picassos, and Franz Marx were hung on standalone walls scattered around the lobby. I prefer 20th century artists over the old masters, particularly Marx. His use of bold colors makes him one of my favorite painters. Like I told you earlier, how Manley secured the funding for his business remained unknown. But whatever the process, it appeared he secured more than he needed. Before I could finish admiring all the paintings, a short, bald, chubby gentleman with thick glasses and sporting a black Nehru jacket exited the elevator. He said, "Agent Powers, will you accompany me, please?" I nodded and followed him to the elevators. We ascended in silence to the 25th floor. When the door opened, he gestured for me to exit. I did. He didn't. Another android stood there and spoke with a British accent. "Please, follow me, sir. I trailed behind the machine until we reached an office with an open door. Inside, Reed Manley stood. The tall, slender man wore black jeans and a maroon turtleneck. He moved from behind the massive oak desk to offer his hand. Crystal blue eyes stared at me from behind square-rimmed glasses perched at the end of a prominent Roman nose. As we shook, he said, "Agent Powers, it's been what, 7 years?" Hiding my surprise, he recognized me. I replied, "Yes, at the Congressional Symposium on the Ethics of Time Travel." "That's right. What can I do for you this morning?" I reached into the inside pocket of my bomber jacket and handed him the subpoena. "I need to review your company's jump records." He looked at the paperwork and pursed his lips. "I am afraid I can't do that without conferring with our corporate attorneys." "Unfortunately, that piece of paper gives me the right with or without your attorney's approval." He folded his arms. "Why the subpoena? I've always cooperated with the federal government about the authorized jumps we conduct. It's the unauthorized ones they want to know about." He smiled and returned to his desk. When he sat, he opened his top drawer and pulled out a 10-inch data pad. He looked up and asked, "When did these supposed unauthorized jumps occur, Agent Powers?" "They're listed in the subpoena." He laid the data pad on his desk and clasped his hands in front of him. "I can't let you see our jump records, Agent." "And why is that?" "Because if you saw them, you would arrest me immediately." He reached into a desk drawer and retrieved what looked like a dart gun. All I remember after that was a stinging sensation in my chest. Day 2, October 2069. I regained consciousness in a small room. Complete darkness surrounded me, but I could sense how close the walls were. I felt my left wrist and discovered my chronometer watch remained there. I touched a small button on the side, and the face displayed my location and the local time. Apparently, I had been unconscious for about 18 hours and remained in Pasadena. The glow from the watch verified the room's size. It appeared to be a 4-by-4-foot area with foam eggshell wall coverings, similar to a recording studio. I sat on a straight-back chair and felt my torso bound to the seat, but my arms and legs were free. Silence prevailed. Not even the sound of an air conditioner could be heard. From a speaker above me, Manley said, "Ah, Agent Powers, you have arrived and are awake. Detaining a federal agent is a felony. Yes, I'm aware of the consequences, but you see, I have a reason for detaining you. And that is, you are going to help me prove a jump to the future is possible." "I'm not following you." "No, I didn't think you would. You see, I need a volunteer to make the jump, and since it has never been done before, not too many of my associates are anxious to raise their hand. You, however, have no choice." I didn't answer right away, thinking he would continue, but he did not. Finally, I asked, "How far into the future?" "Actually, you already made a short jump of 18 hours, and you survived. So now we are going to push you out a mere 200 years. How long was I unconscious?" "From your reference, 15 minutes. My inclination to distrust the man remained, but I knew 18 hours passed without my being aware of it. I asked, "How will you know you've been successful?" "That's why we haven't sent you yet. We are trying to calculate how long to keep you there, so you can tell us what you observed." "Manley, you're not thinking four-dimensionally." "What do you mean?" "You seem to forget since we have time travel in 2069, it will still exist in 2269. We are now in their past. I'm sure they will know I've made the jump and will be waiting for me." Silence. Apparently my logic was impeccable because the seconds ticked off without a comment from him. After what I guessed to be 5 minutes, I said, "Are you there?" "Yes." "Any thoughts on what I said?" "I'm thinking." "How are you going to address my absence when the FBI comes looking for me? They know I'm here." we have access to the past. Maybe you never joined the FBI, or maybe you were never born. His statement gave me pause. After a moment, I said, "They'll send someone else. I'm not that important." You underestimate the subtleties of time travel. We are currently in the process of tweaking the past, preparing for a better future. One change in the distant past can create a different outcome in the future. So you're saying Stephen Hawking's hypothesis of chronology protection conjecture is incorrect? Powers, you said it yourself. It's a hypothesis. Have you been able to observe any differences because of your so-called tweaking? Silence again. After 15 seconds, I said, "That's what I thought. You can't tell if you have." I paused a few moments, but he remained quiet. I continued, "Even if you have changed the past, how would you know? Any variations you might make would now be part of your history. You would have no knowledge of the difference. I have to agree with Hawking. History can't be changed." The room started to vibrate, and I felt the sensations associated with a time jump. Day 3. Date unknown. Normally, the disorientation after a jump takes a few minutes to overcome. While I don't understand the actual mechanics, I do understand what happens to a physical object projected back in time. The time portal basically creates a bubble around an object, be it an empty chair or a chair with a person sitting on it. The bubble is separated from normal space/time. The bubble must be kept in the same location on the planet. If it is not, it will reappear in the vacuum of space. Not a good thing for the person being transported through time. So the tricky part of a time jump is the mathematics to figure out where the Earth will be in relationship to the Sun at the destination time. Remember, the Earth is revolving on its axis while at the same time orbiting around the Sun. The Sun also moves within the galaxy as the galaxy travels through the universe. Understanding the algorithms that take all of this movement into account within the computer of a time machine is way above my pay grade. The energy required for a time jump is also incredible. Theoretically, moving forward in time is thought to be impossible, but Manley's experiment seemed to have worked. When I regained consciousness, I remained in my chair surrounded by an outdoor space with the sun directly overhead. Standing in a semicircle in front of my position were 10 humanoid beings staring at me. I say humanoid because at first, they didn't look like real people. All were of the same height and similar facial features. In other words, clones. Before my disorientation could dissipate, 5 of them rushed forward, freed me from the chair, and carried me toward a glass building. Once inside, they slowed their pace as we approached an open door. A large table with chairs surrounding it occupied the room we entered. They gently placed me in a chair at the head of the table. Then each of my captors sat and stared at me. The dizziness subsided enough that I could speak. Where am I? The individual closest to me tilted his head. In a flat voice with little inflection, he said, "You are still where you were when you started your journey. A better question would be to ask the date." "Okay, what's the date?" "Using a calendar you would understand. October 2269. I think I blinked several times before I could find any words. Finally I said, "So it worked. I'm 200 years into the future?" "From your perspective, yes." I studied the faces of each person surrounding me. On closer examination, while similar, each face showed subtle differences. 2 were female, and the other 3 appeared male. The difference being the females had breasts, the others were flat-chested. "Why do each of you look similar?" The individual who spoke earlier smiled. "From your viewpoint, I am sure we do. However, each of us is a unique individual, programmed at birth for a specific function." While I consider myself to be a quick learner, this statement took me by surprise. Programmed at birth? Yes, humans have evolved over the past 200 years, by combining what you, in your time frame, would have called artificial intelligence with genetic engineering. He gestured toward the others at the table. Each of us, plus others, have been tasked with protecting the current state of mankind. So that means what? You cannot stay. We must send you back to your own time. This was good news. I really did not want to spend the rest of my life in this vanilla-appearing culture. So you still have time travel? Yes, but you are going to help us stop it from being developed. With a chuckle, I said, how am I going to do that? We have discovered 2 points in time that were crucial to developing the process. Each of the individuals sat at the table exactly the same, back straight, arms on the table in front of them with their hands clasped. They all wore their hair the same, short. Plus, they were dressed identically in white jumpsuits. I folded my arms but remained silent, waiting for the speaker to continue. The first critical junction occurred when Reed Manley attended Caltech. He crossed paths with an individual who taught there for only a year. There are 0 public records of this man before the year 2036 or after. That's a bit suspicious, isn't it? Sounds like he might be a time traveler as well. Yes, we believe him to be so. What's his name? Caltech records show the name he used to be Albert Sagan. With a chuckle, I said, he combined Albert Einstein and Carl Sagan's names. All 5 of the individuals started looking at each other with wide eyes. The spokesman regained his composure and said, "It would appear so. We did not see the relationship before." I took a deep breath. This conversation grew more surreal as it progressed. If you know when he traveled back, why not stop him? We would need to know the exact date and year, plus his location. We do not. All we know is where he will be in 2036. Okay, I get that. What is the other occurrence you mentioned? If nothing can be done about the first encounter, the second critical junction is when Reed Manley visited his younger self to give instructions on what stocks to buy. Those purchases resulted in the funding which led to the creation of Time Lane Inc. Did he visit him before or after the encounters with the time-traveling professor? We believe it to be toward the end of Sagan's presence. Records show Manley already understood the mathematics of time travel. We assume he readily agreed with his future self to buy the stocks. With this revelation, I sat back in the chair I occupied and looked at each one of their near-identical faces. What makes all of you believe I can help? The quintuplet farthest away from me touched a small data pad and slid it toward me. When it stopped, I turned it so I could see the screen. Shock, confusion, and finally realization flashed as I read the screenshot of a news feed from 2079. FBI names Ryan Powers, 49, as next director. Another clone, identical to the ones sitting at the table, entered the room and handed the speaker a box. For some reason, I started thinking of him as Fred. As the newcomer exited, Fred opened the box and extracted my chronometer. My eyes flashed to my left wrist, and I realized for the first time it was not there. Fred noticed my eyes darting from my wrist to my chronometer. "Mr. Powers, we need access to this device to make a few modifications." What type of modifications? You being named as the FBI director in 2079 means we must return you to 2069. To do this, we have to be able to track you. With a slight shake of my head, I raised both hands, palms toward them. Guys, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told Reed Manley before he sent me here. You're not thinking four-dimensionally. If I go back to 2036 and stop this Albert Sagan from passing information to Reed Manley, time travel might not be invented, and suddenly, I'm stuck in 2036. Fred stared at me without blinking for almost 2 minutes. This I found strange and a bit eerie. Finally, he said, "Then We have a paradox. What paradox? You cannot stay in 2036 and be named FBI director at the age of 49 in 2079. Yeah, if that happens, I'll be 83 by then. Fred turned to the woman next to him. Would you please show Mr. Powers to his room? My room, if it could be called such, consisted of a bed, an open bathroom area, a storage unit, and something the woman who escorted me called a regenerative unit. What's a regenerative unit? You can prepare a meal with it from the stores in that cabinet. She pointed to a light brown box next to the entrance to the bathroom. How do I do that? She looked at me like I had 3 eyes. Hey, lady, I'm not from around here. I would give you a data pad, but we need to keep you as isolated as possible. Why? You must not learn too much about the future. Good, because I already know too much. She smiled and proceeded to explain how to prepare a meal. Before she left, she showed me where to hang my clothes for cleaning. I hope you will return them? Another smile. Of course. You have to wear them to return to your time. There's a clean outfit in the bathroom for you to use tonight. Then you knew I would arrive today? Oh yes. We've known for several decades when to expect you. We have been planning this for a long time. After she left, I tried the door. Locked, of course. I sat on the bed and tried to figure out what my next steps would be. Weariness overtook me, so I stood and entered the bathroom. Imagine my relief to find a shower which actually used water. I had been in the same clothes for 3 days, and I needed to clean up. I slept until the next morning when an electronic chime sounded on the regenerative unit. Day 4, October 2269. Breakfast consisted of a reconstituted banana and something resembling toast. It didn't taste like toast, so who knows? The coffee the unit prepared actually tasted pretty good. Apparently, genetically engineered AI beings like coffee. After I ate, there came a knock at the door. I opened it and found Fred. At least it looked like Fred, and when he spoke, it sounded like Fred. But I had not heard the other men speak at the table yesterday. Good morning, Mr. Powers. I trust you rested well. I did, thank you. What should I call you? You can call me anything you like. The way we identify each other has changed over the past 100 years. I believe it would be wise for you to not know about the process. Fred. I'll call you Fred. As you wish. He handed my chronometer to me and I put it on. I looked at it and saw the date, October 29, 2269. My location, Los Angeles. It didn't say California or the United States. Probably best if I didn't know. He looked at the jumpsuit I wore. Your clothes will be returned to you in an hour. Please put them on and touch the button on the left of your wrist device when you are ready. He pointed to my chronometer. I meant to ask you what modifications were made. Nothing devious, I assure you. We merely replaced one of the chips. The new chip will perform the same function as it did in the past. Plus, it will let us track your whereabouts in space and time. That way, we can return you to your own period. If you have it examined, no one will be able to figure it out. The technology won't be invented until earlier this century. Sorry. I shrugged. Fine with me. When am I going back? Today. After dressing in my own clothes, they escorted me back to the conference room. This time an additional female sat at the table. Fred started the meeting. Mr. Powers, we apologize for keeping you isolated, but it is for ours and your best interests. After our conversation yesterday, we have modified our plans. I would hope so. Fred furrowed his brow and shifted his attention to the others at the table. Returning his focus to me, he said, I assure you, the plan we discussed yesterday is still a viable option. For you, yes. For me, no. He tilted his head slightly. Explain, please. Any action that keeps time travel from being developed before I return to my timeline runs the risk of stranding me in the past, which, as you suggested yesterday, can change history, and who knows what else. Mr. Powers, I assure you, once time travel is eliminated from history, everything will return to normal. What is normal? Your timeline or my timeline? There are too many unknown unknowns. This whole conversation is illogical. What if every time some engineer or physicist figures out how to manipulate time, it splinters and two separate timelines emerge? Who's to say it already hasn't happened and there are multiple timelines running in parallel? Stopping Albert Sagan before he can talk to Reed Manley seems to be the best bet. We do not know from when or where he comes. I raised my left arm. Well, you've already placed a tracker on me. Why not do it to Albert Sagan? Fred's eyebrows rose. He blinked several times and turned to the woman who had not attended the previous day's meeting. What do you think? I think Mr. Powers raises a valid point. I was shocked. She actually spoke with a slight British accent. She continued, since all of these events are in our past, we can send Mr. Powers to 2036 and plant a tracker on Sagan. Once we have a lock on him, we bring him here. End of sequence. I rolled my eyes. These were supposedly genetically engineered humans with superior intelligence. You left out one outcome. She looked at me. What is that? I'll be stuck in 2036. On the contrary, the original timeline will be restored. I'm not sure how long it took me to pick my jaw up from the floor. I stared at her for a long time. You are kidding me, right? Extremely serious. What's so important about this guy? No one spoke, with Fred scratching his chin. You guys may be genetically engineered, but someone forgot to include the poker face gene. Fred furrowed his brows. Poker face gene? I've been a cop for a long time. I can read the thoughts of everyone at this table. You all know who this Albert Sagan guy is, and you're not telling me. As Fred glanced at each of the individuals sitting at the table, each gave him a single nod. He returned his attention to me. I wish we possessed the time to discuss this poker face concept with you, Mr. Powers, but time is of the essence. No, it's not. You have access to time travel. We have all the time in the universe. If only that were the case, every moment we hesitate, the past becomes less pliable. Who is Albert Sagan? We really don't know his true identity. However, we were not completely truthful with you yesterday. He is from our future. I remained quiet, waiting for Fred to continue. 500 years from now, our bioengineered species will be extinct. Mankind will revert to what Darwin called natural selection. Sagan's mission is to keep bioengineered humans from being developed in the first place. We can't allow him to be successful. Okay, now the truth comes out. Self-preservation. I get it. Good, because it is crucial you stop Sagan, not us. If we try to stop him, computer models do not project a favorable outcome. With a smile, I pointed to the chronometer. Exactly what does this do for me? It is a direct conduit to our time portal. It allows you to determine where and when you need to go. Does it come with an instruction manual? Day 5, year unknown. I am now convinced the bioengineered computer-enhanced versions of mankind are complete morons. I have absolutely no idea of the date or year. I believe I am still in the Los Angeles area because I can smell the ocean from where I stand. However, there is zero evidence of civilization in the area. I am either millennia into the future, or I am in pre-human settled North America. I hesitate to explore too far from my location, this being the advice from Fred. He hasn't been right about too much, but this advice I will take. From what he told me before my jump, the device on my wrist can read star positions and calculate the month and year within a few days. I arrived late yesterday with clouds obscuring the night sky. I hope it clears tonight so I can figure out my next jump. The only intelligent decision Fred made before I left provided me with a backpack containing food, water, and a few other items. They designed the backpack from historic images. However, I am quite sure the material used to construct it did not exist in 2036. So much for the superior intellect. The sun is setting and the sky is clear. I hope my chronometer can pinpoint my timeline so I can start the process of traveling to 2036. My benefactors provided me with a half-dozen trackers, one of which I am to secure to Albert Sagan. That's the plan. How I am going to accomplish the task is open for debate. As darkness descends, the stars are brilliant. I don't believe I have ever seen them this bright. Holding the chronometer out facing the sky, I am immediately rewarded with a chime. Looking at the display, a sinking feeling sweeps over me. I am 10,000 years into the future. I touch the red button on the side of the device, and the night sky blinks out. Day 6, October 2036. My surroundings are familiar. Pasadena. I know that Caltech is 6 blocks to my west, and the house I grew up in is a little less than a mile to the east. I plan to stay as far away from there as I can. While I would like to see my parents again, I am currently 10 years older than they were at my birth. I prefer to keep my current memories of them intact. I have 2 immediate problems. 1, I do not possess any 2036 money. Problem 1 leads to problem 2, nowhere to stay. I know there are homeless shelters all over Pasadena, but I hesitate to be around people too much as I might run into a younger version of someone I know. Tricky business, this time traveling. Addressing problem number 1. How does a time traveler acquire money quickly without resorting to something unethical or illegal? The answer? Standing on a corner at a stoplight and holding a sign. Even in 2069, people do it all the time. As I stood there on the street corner, holding my hand-printed sign with the words, "Homeless, anything will help, God bless," I felt a little disingenuous, but I reconciled my ethical conundrum by telling myself I was homeless and did need help. Anyway, in the span of about 6 hours, I collected over $600. Not bad considering I don't make quite that much per hour as an FBI agent. A thought occurred to me while I stood there. How many other homeless people you see begging for money are simply time travelers like me? Interesting thought. After a night's rest, a decent meal, and clean underwear purchased at a nearby Walmart, I made my way to the Caltech campus. I found Albert Sagan with ease. He taught in the Feynman building. In 2036, the structure, being brand new, housed both the theoretical and applied physics departments. Sagan taught in the theoretical department, with one of his students being a young and impressionable Reed Manley. How did I know this? I sat outside the lecture hall and watched Manley enter. I followed him in and sat in the top row of the lecture hall. Sagan entered the room near the podium and started his lesson. My first impression of Sagan left me underwhelmed. A small man, he stood maybe 5'6", and if he weighed 120 pounds, I would be shocked. His shrill voice reminded me of an owl's shriek. I watched Manley during the class. He made copious notes, and his attention never strayed from the lecturer. Other students around him seemed to be wishing they were anywhere else but listening to this man talk. Halfway through the lecture, I snuck out the door when Sagan turned his back to write something on the whiteboard at the front of the room. Making my way to the professor's entrance to the lecture hall took some doing. I finally found it with 5 minutes to spare. From my backpack, I retrieved one of the trackers given to me by Fred. My instructions were to adhere to his body, not close, and then stand back. Fred assured me once I have it on his skin, the man would not be able to take it off. We will see. Standing to the side of the door where Sagan would emerge, I heard the unmistakable sound of students getting their books together, a chorus of indistinguishable conversations, and people shuffling out of the room en masse. The professor burst through the door and I immediately said, "Albert Sagan." He turned, stared at me, and furrowed his brow. "Professor Sagan." I offered my hand. "Sorry, Professor, do you have a moment?" Without thinking, he shook it. immediately released it as if shocked, and then stared at his palm. Looking up at me, he said, "Who are you?" "FBI." As his eyes widened, he vanished. Apparently, the tracker immediately allowed them to transport Sagan back to 2269 to face questioning. My next task was to get the heck out of Feynman Hall, find an isolated spot, and press the blue button on my chronometer. I found an area behind the maintenance building and pressed the button. Absolutely nothing happened. Day 7, Halloween 2036. As I feared, I am stuck in the year 2036. I even took one of the trackers and put it on the back of my hand. I'm still here. After much internal debate, I've decided to approach Reed Manley and find out what he knows. The $600 I earned standing on the street corner will last me a few more days if I count my pennies. So I have a roof over my head for at least 2 more nights. After that, I'll need to figure out how to get an ID so I can find a job. At least I know where I needed to be at 2 p.m. this afternoon. At 5 minutes before the scheduled class time, Reed Manley walked into the lecture hall and I followed. Sitting down next to him, he glanced at me as he prepared to take notes on a 10-inch tablet. I leaned over and whispered, "You won't need that today." He looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "Why do you say that?" "Albert Sagan left town." He frowned. "How would you know?" "Trust me, I know." 5 minutes passed and no professor. At 10 minutes past the hour, half of the students stood to leave. It took another 10 minutes for the room to clear out, except for myself and Manley. He turned to me. "Okay, tell me what happened to Professor Sagan. What do you know about him?" Without answering, he put his tablet back in his backpack and started to stand. "Sit down." He glared at me and slowly returned to his seat. "I don't recognize you from this class. Who are you?" "I'll ask you again, what do you know about Sagan?" "Theoretical physicist, brilliant, and a bit odd." "Did you ever have any one-on-one conversations with him?" A frown appeared. "Maybe. Why do you ask?" "Because I know more than you think I do." "I don't have to answer your questions. I'm out of here." As he stood, I growled, "Sit down." He returned to his chair faster this time. "I'm going to ask you this question only once. If you lie to me, I'll know." "Who are you?" "I'm an FBI agent. Want to see my badge?" "Oh, shit." He then nodded. I reached into my bomber jacket, pulled out my ID and said, "Note the date on it." He looked at the ID, which I'm glad I kept with me, and then shut his eyes. He seemed to slowly melt into the chair. "You don't look surprised, Reed." "I didn't think I would ever be able to prove it, but the calculations Albert gave me seemed to confirm my hypothesis." "That time travel is possible?" Manley nodded. "Well, it is, or was." "What do you mean was?" "I'm the one who sent Albert Sagan back to the future, where he probably ran into some people who are extremely unhappy with him." "Why are you still here?" "Because I'm stuck. Apparently, I changed the timeline by sending Sagan back." "What do you mean stuck?" "I can't get back to 2069 when all of this started because of you." Manley's eyes grew wide as he stared at me. "Let me guess, your older self has already given you the list of stocks to buy." He answered with a slow nod. I stood. "I hate to tell you this, but if you buy those stocks, you will provide the funds needed to develop commercial time travel. And that, my young friend, creates all kinds of problems for the human race in the future." I walked out of the lecture hall without a good feeling I would ever get back to 2069. Day 10, November 2036. Swallowing my pride, I stood on a street corner in Pasadena for 2 days and raised a little over $800. On the second day, I saw a vehicle pass with a small boy in the back seat. He looked like me from pictures I used to possess. While I did not see the driver, I knew it to be my mother. The reason I knew this is because the vehicle was the one my parents drove, and she always made me sit in the back seat. I decided never to return to this particular corner. While standing there, I did figure out how to get a job. In fact, I spoke to the Pasadena chief of police about it. I took a course on how to detect counterfeit documents during my first year as an FBI agent. It also taught me how to create a fake ID. With a little effort, I discreetly changed the birth date on my FBI ID from 2030 to 2000. While a small change, it helped the chief accept my story about wanting to start a new career. He's waiving my need to attend the police academy, and I start next week as a detective. Day 365, November 2037. I'm resigned to the fact I will never return to my life in 2069. In some respects, I'm glad. I met a beautiful woman who teaches at a primary education school here in Pasadena. She doesn't recognize me. My 7-year-old self is currently in her class. I know this because she thought it funny. A student of hers and I shared the same name. I remember having a huge crush on her while in 2nd grade. We've set a wedding date for this coming spring. Plus, there's another reason for my conviction about not returning. Last week, I answered a request to investigate an unattended death. The victim turned out to be Reed Manley. On the investigation report, I declared the death to be a suicide. However, I failed to mention in the report I removed a clear disc the size of a dime from his neck. It appeared similar to the tracking devices I carried back from my encounter with Fred. I'm not sure how they did it, but someone from the 23rd century transported back to the 21st and murdered Reed Manley. Apparently, Stephen Hawking was incorrect. History can be changed. And guess what? I'm okay with it.
Chilling tales for dark nights.